This is a discussion of the essay On Liberation, which was published by Ignacio Ellacuría in 1989. And his first question of this essay is, liberation from what? You'll remember from the beginning of the course, I said we need to address 4 basic questions in this course, which include liberation from what, liberation to what, liberation by means of what, and liberation for the sake of what. And here Ellacuría is discussing that first question, liberation from what? Firstly, from sin. This is a theological work, so we have to talk about the idea of sin. Also, liberation from death, if you think that might be possible, maybe. And liberation from the law. And that might be a controversial claim as well. And Ellacuría says that none of these dimensions of salvation are exclusively individual, but are also collective or social. And he says, quote, these affect the interiority of individuals, but they also affect their totality and fullness. Now, that is an expression of what we learned by Zubiri's term dimension, the expression of the entire into the X, the interior, what it is to be something, outward into the openness and respectivity of the real, where all things are what they are as a function of everything else. So you can hear Zubiri's ideas at work right here in Ellacuría. Sin actually takes on a number of manifestations. There's first original or natural sin. Liberation from this, Ellacuría says, begins with our incorporation into the body of Christ. He's a Christian, so this is the way he's going to think about it. But it's ongoing. It doesn't end there. It starts there. Our baptism, for instance, is the beginning of a process of liberation from original sin. It's not the end of that process or instantaneous. There's no immediate liberation from the consequences of sin. We should not forget that. If there has been sin, there have been consequences of that sin. And just because we are able somehow to become liberated from our natural or original sin does not mean it automatically wipes away all the consequences of sin. Ellacuría says this is a progressive and historical liberation that we're talking about here. There's also personal sin. Those are the sins we've actually committed. In a sense, original sin is a structure. It goes to part of the makeup of what it means to be a human being, even to be made in the image and likeness of God. Original sin refers to a structure, not to the first sin of any particular human being, but a structural feature of us, an inclination or a tendency. Personal sin, it refers to the sins that we commit. But Ellacuría reminds us these are never simply individual. This is about the liberation of the agent, the one who acts. And it's liberation from the effects of that act. So Ellacuría says no sin, not even the most original or interior, fails to have repercussions of some manner over the configuration of the person and the course of history. And again, remember in Zubiri, we have to make our I as agents, actors, and authors with the capacities that the tradition has handed over to us. And as we make ourselves, we make the world as well, because of the respectivity and the openness of the real. Again, Zubiri's ideas are being expressed concretely now by Ellacuría. And then there's also what Ellacuría calls historical or social sin. And this is sin that you can't attribute to some particular individual human being. But they're structural. They're effects of sin and causes of new sins, new personal sins as well. We are victims of impersonal structures that have been structured out of personal sin as expressions of original sin. But these structures, these institutions, the social practices, they take on a life of their own. And the negative effects or consequences of these kind of sins affect us all to one degree or another. But you can't say that an unjust structure is the fault of some particular person with a proper name. We're all implicated in it, but none of us has committed it expressly personally. That is a feature or an understanding of sin that has been an insight of liberation theology. And we'll talk more about that as we go along in the course. So the triple sins are the fundamental obstacle to liberation. It's an obstacle between human beings and God. It's an obstacle between us human beings. And very importantly, especially in our own times here, it's an obstacle between humans and the rest of creation and the rest of nature. Very, very important effects of especially structural sin and the tragedy of the relations between humans and nature. Triple sins are dominators and oppressors. They are, Ellacuría says, the negation of the faith, and they are recognizable by their negation of love. Death is understood biblically as an effect of sin. It's caused by the law. If we think about it in the story of the Garden of Eden, if God had created Adam and Eve and said, Adam meet Eve, Eve meet Adam, here's a wonderful garden, help yourself to anything in it, and live happily ever after, there could not possibly have been sin. There can't be sin unless there's a law, unless there's a no. And something, some barrier, some fence that we break past or transcend. So without the law, there couldn't possibly be sin. If they took away the speed limit, you could never, by law, legally be going too fast. You need the law in order for there to be some meaningful sense of breaking that law. Death, according to Ellacuría, is both theologal. What is that? Again, it's coming from Zubiri. That's that dimension of divine reality that we are all problematically living our lives with respect to. And of course, it's also biological. Ellacuri writes, the overabundance of sin in history carries with it an overabundance of death in history. Continues, liberation theology contemplates God as the God of life and consequently contemplates sin as an agent of death. One of the best ways to struggle against sin is to struggle against death in all its forms, but initially in the form of human survival. Because of misery, hunger, lack of basic necessities, and sickness caused by oppression and repression, the majority of human beings die before their time. That is, life is taken from them, and with it, the very possibility to be the glory of God. Liberation from death can only be definitively accomplished after death, in eternal life. If we're talking about the biological component of death, and unless somebody else figures something out, the only way to achieve liberation from biological death, well, we don't have an answer. There seems to be no way. They always say death and taxes are guaranteed. Well, okay, biological death. But for the Christian, in this particular case, we're talking about Ellacuría as a Christian. For the Christian, there is the possibility of eternal life, the victory over death. However, Ellacuría says, whether you believe in that or not, emphasis should be on life without oppression, crying, sickness, division, and this can and should be anticipated and worked towards now, earnestly worked towards now. Liberation from the law. Law is the great midwife of sin. Now, what's a midwife? A midwife is somebody that helps a woman give birth. The baby does not belong to the midwife. It's not the midwife's baby. And the law is not the parent of sin in this regard. However, sin being structural can come to light, become manifest through the law, through commandments, as we were speaking of earlier. Liberation from the law, in Ellacuri's mind, does not mean anarchy. He's very explicit about this. He says, law is a necessary evil. It's necessary because human beings need to mirror the order and structure that can be found in creation, but it's an evil for reasons that will become clear. In the church, for instance, law tends to become mere restraint. Don't. Right? We get the idea that people are made for the law instead of the law made for the people. He cites a passage from Mark 2:27 about the Sabbath. Is the Sabbath made for people, or are people made for the Sabbath? I think this is an important question we need to ask ourselves all the time. Is the law there for the benefit and well-being of us, or are we there at the dominance of the law for the law's sake and those who benefit from those laws? In government, speaking of which, law is often justification for institutional oppression, repression, and injustice. Law, quoting Ellacuría, makes for a world in which there is an exploitative life for some and an exploited life for others. It is this law that legitimates social sin, that structural sin, proposing unreachable ideals negated in practice while protecting the established disorder favorable to a few and disadvantageous to the majority. Now, how can this be? How does that work? Well, I'll give you an example from American history. There was once a set of laws on the books that included, for instance, that certain people are not permitted to drink from this water fountain. If your skin color was such, you are not permitted to drink from this water fountain. And you're a human and you need water, and you're thirsty and there's a fountain. But if you have the wrong skin color, you can't drink from this fountain. Now, you say, well, I'm going to. Well, that's against the law. Well, how can it be against the law? Well, we've elected representatives, and they've gone to the State House, and they've passed the law, and the governor signed it, so it's the law. It's the law. But that law became a justification for racism, both personal racism and structural racism, and injustice, therefore. That's exactly the kind of example that Ellacuría would say illustrates what he's talking about. Faith and justice, well, he says there's no faith or salvation without justice. You could say I'm a person of faith, but without justice, he says no. Now, you could attain justice and even salvation of a sort, of the kind we're talking about, without faith. He says that might be possible. However, he says, what is certain is that the full truth of justice and consequently of justification is not reached except by faith. For example, only from faith can one affirm that the preferential option for the poor, the partiality in favor of the most needy, is from Christian justice. And I want to pause on this point because it's important. Liberation theology would, if it had a single motto, it would be the preferential option for the poor. When we reach a decision point in society, we should prefer what is best for the poor and the needy first. That's what we should do. Now, if you say, well, why? Give me a rationale for that. Wouldn't it be better to privilege the rich because they're so successful? Maybe that would be a better idea. What would justify this preferential option for the poor? And Ellacuría says there is only one justification, through faith. Without faith, you may not be able to argue rationally any more for the preferential option for the poor than you could argue for the preferential option for the rich. However, according to Ellacuría, justice is not justice until it's justice for all. So hence the idea of the Christian idea of justice, that you begin with preference for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the outcast, the stranger. It's biblical. Liberation and freedom from versus liberation and freedom for. These are important concepts. What does it mean to be liberated from sin for being children of God? We want to be liberated from sin, and we want to be liberated so that we can truly be the children of God. What does that mean? Well, freedom is from oppression. Freedom means a kind of auto-determination or autonomy or self-possession, what it means to be a person, as we learned. Freedom is about being what we are, self-possessing, auto-determined to a certain extent. So freedom is from oppression. Freedom is for justice, which includes a process of personal conversion and societal historical transformation and possibly revolution. Now, when some people hear the idea of revolution, they take heed. People don't respond very quickly to a radical change, but it may, according to Ellacuría, depending on circumstances, may be required for justice. Revolution might be required for justice. The whole history of civilization is marked by transformative revolutions for good or ill, which is part of the paradox, part of the enigma. The situation, Zubiri might say, calls us out, calls for some response, but it doesn't tell us what would be the right response, and we need to be responsible for that. So revolution is no guarantee that we land in justice, but it may well be required for it. He says that there's a negative aspect here, but he doesn't mean bad. He just means the part where you have to break out of something. Release from internal and external bonds that diminish potential, or as Zubiri would say, more accurately, capacitation for freedom. So that means we gotta break something down, or break something up, or break something open. That's what he means by negative. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's good. It's necessary. But that's what he means by the negative aspect. But there's also a positive or a creative aspect of this process, to strengthen one's own autonomy and configuring auto-determination, self-possession, making our personality, making our I. So we free ourselves from the bonds that limit our capacitation, and we free ourselves for creatively making our I as agents, actors, and authors. He says, look, we're still going to have our internal tendencies. It's the theological word is concupiscence, to do wrong. And we're going to have external pressures. And the idea is to try to increase our control over them. Remember what Ellacuría says about philosophy being a polemos, of being a struggle. It's a struggle against yourself, and it's a struggle against the powers that be. Well, here we see that same idea that we found in What is the Point of Philosophy? Well, we see it right here again. We have to struggle against our own internal tendencies towards sin, and we have to struggle against the external pressures, the social structures that seem to direct us towards sin, and that put up obstacles to our being persons, being auto-determining persons. It's an endless process. But he doesn't want to. He's not a perfectionist, he doesn't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Yeah, it's an endless process. He almost sounds like a Protestant reformer. Semper reformata was one of the mottos. We're always reforming. We're reformed, but always reforming. We always have to reform. And Ellacuría would agree with that. But it doesn't mean that there's no freedom until we have absolutely full liberation. Freedom and self-determination and being persons and being the best we can be is an ongoing process that we just need to keep at. We're never really done with it. And you could look at his note on page 48. It's he says sometimes what looks like freedom really isn't freedom. We say that we have the freedom to buy whatever we want, but is that are we really free if how we view ourselves, the ideology that gives us our lenses, makes us see ourselves as consumers first and foremost? Is the freedom really free? And one cannot speak of freedom in the personal and historical if material and objective conditions are not given for it. And again, you can take a look at those passages for more details about that. But it's all well and good to talk about freedom, but if you don't have a place to live, if you don't have food on the table, it's no good for somebody to tell you, yeah, well, you're at least you're free. There's no law against living where you're living under a bridge somewhere. No, that's not going to cut it, says Ellacuría. Like Zubiri says, it's about capacitation. It's about not just having historical possibilities for doing something, but the actual concrete material capacity for realizing your possibilities as a human being. That's important. Democratic forms of government offer formal freedoms, but do the people have the capacity for freedom? You could say, well, the people have the formal freedom to vote, but are there structures in place that prevent people from voting? Do they actually have the real life concrete material capacity to go vote? That's a question that people should be asking right now. In liberalism, the individual is the proper subject of freedom. Now, liberalism doesn't mean liberal versus conservative. I think it's best to understand that we live in a liberal society. There are conservative liberals and moderate liberals and liberal liberals, but liberalism means freedom. Freedom. The arguments that we have so vehemently in this country all are over the idea of freedom. Both sides, if there are only two, agree. We want to be free. The question is, what does that look like? What does it mean to be free? That means we're liberals. We're not monarchists here, for instance. We're liberals. Totalitarianism, though, sees the state as the proper subject of freedom, meaning the state should be free to do what it wants. Too bad for the individuals. Liberalism says the individual should be free, and the state has no right to infringe on the basic freedoms of the individuals. Totalitarian states say the state should be free to do whatever it wants to do, regardless of what the individuals think. And again, just to clarify, subject here is this Aristotelian term, that which predicates pertain to, but which is not predicable of anything else. So the subject has properties, properties don't, and subjects are not properties of anything else. So you either have the individual or you have the state is the subject. In Christian liberation, according to Ellacuría, neither individualistic nor collectivistic it is, but it doesn't diminish individual freedom nor reject solidarity. In some ways, this kind of reminds me of an Aristotelian frame of mind, the mean between extremes. Not individuals each doing what she or he wants to do, not collectivistic, everyone doing what the state says they have to do, but trying to find some balance, trying to find some measure, trying to find the mean between those extremes. Political freedom is understood differently in what Ellacuría identifies as Eastern despotism. All are enslaved so that one, the monarch, the despot, might be free. In Greek democracy, many are enslaved, so a few may be free. Remember, we might have had this discussion about the idea of democracy in ancient Greece. You might have learned in your world civilizations or your history courses about the golden age of Greek democracy. But really, democracy was a compromise kind of an idea, so that, if I may put it this way, that philosophers might be safe. If you didn't have too much centralized power, then philosophers could ask their questions and try not to get in trouble, although that didn't always work out in real life. You can ask Socrates about that. But Greek democracy was able to run because of slaves. It employed slavery in its economy. So many are enslaved, so a few might be free, the few propertied citizens. The condition of Christian freedom, all are free so that each may be free. No one's free unless we're all free. The majority must be free and must free themselves, and they must also free the elites from what Ellacuría calls oppressive freedom. Now, this is an important idea. If society is unjust And one of the key ways that a society, any society, might be unjust is there are few haves and many have-nots. Certainly the case in Latin America and Ignacio Ellacuría's experience. Probably our own as well. That the few benefit from the society's structures and the many are disadvantaged by them. The majority who are disadvantaged must work to free themselves, Ellacuría says, but they must recognize that the elites, no matter how much they're benefiting from the social structures as they are in the status quo, are themselves not able to be the best they can be. No matter what they might think about themselves, they too are bound by these unjust social structures. So freedom has to be worked for not just for the poor majority, although that's important as we'll see, but for the elites that have oppressed and subjugated them. Everybody's enslaved to unjust structures. Christian liberation prioritizes the poor, as we said, the preferential option for the poor, that motto of liberation theology. The poor, Ellacuría says, is the audience of the good news. That's who the good news, the gospel, is for. The poor. It's meant for the poor. Jesus said, I come to bring the good news for the poor. But the poor is also the announcer of the good news. The poor majority is prophetic in Ellacuría's view. Why is that? Because when you see poverty, when you see suffering, when you see repression and oppression, when you see the victims of structural sin, that can be the wake-up call. It's sounding the alarm to society that there is injustice and that it cannot stand and it will not stand forever. So the poor is to receive the good news of their liberation, but they're also, in their very existence, the announcer of the good news. And we'll hear this idea again from Ellacuría. It's kind of like a Kantian idea, if you remember. For Kant, where's the moral law come from? Reason, the structure of reason alone. Not from God, not from society, reason, right? Who does reason issue the moral commands to? Act in such a way that your maxim for acting could be willed to be a universal law. Do your duty, whatever your duty may be. Never lie. Who is the audience for reason's moral announcement? Reason. Reason issues the command to itself. That's what Kant meant by autonomy. It's a command of reason, a moral law issued by reason to reason. And I think there's a parallel in what Ellacuría is saying here. The poor, in their very poverty, announces the need for the good news that could be heard by the poor, who could act accordingly. The good news, according to Ellacuría, God wants to save human beings so that God's strength may be seen more clearly in human weakness, and God's love may be seen in God's preference for those who are most vulnerable. The poor is the audience for that word, and in their poverty is the announcer of that word. There are various kinds of freedom, Ellacuría points out. There's bourgeois freedom. Bourgeois is a word that refers to capitalism. The bourgeoisie are people who were propertied in a capitalist society. The proletariat consists of the people who are wage slaves, who don't own property, they don't own the means of production. They have to go hat in hand to those who do own capital, those who do own the means of production. So that's where that word comes from. It's a reference to the property classes. And bourgeois freedom is the freedom of those who have property and wealth. It's the freedom that is that manifests itself in property and wealth. It's meant to be liberation of a kind of an aristocracy or an elite, possibly an oligarchy. It confuses having more with being more, which Ellacuría calls a diabolical temptation. Such a temptation to think that if just because I have more, I am more, and I'm more important. And some kind of domination becomes the condition of this kind of freedom. In order for the wealthy to have their freedom, there have to be constraints on the majority. Christian freedom, on the other hand, holds wealth as an obstacle to the reign of God. It's harder for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle. It's harder for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Right? It can be is, I don't know if that's too strong, but it can be an obstacle to the reign of God, which Ellacuría understands as true freedom. He says the desire for wealth and consumerist degradation, which is fueled by excessive abundance, continue being fundamental temptations that must be overcome by the strength of faith lived in history. Liberalization, in principle, is a process of increasing subjective and individual freedom. And he says, look, that's a good thing. That has been very good for society. You could view human history as a slow, slogging process of increasing individual freedom. He thinks this idea has exercised a healthy influence on the Christian faith. There's not been as much of this top-down understanding of what the church is all about. He thinks that's all good, at least in principle. But liberation is more than that. It has to deal with the more material aspects of life. It's more integral with the whole of life. It's more real. It's more universal. It's liberation from material oppression. It's liberation from a lack of basic necessities. It's liberation from repression, from fear, terror, and the juridical, political, and ideological sources of fear and terror. It's a liberation from our dependencies, our personal, individual inclinations, our passions, our attractions, and especially our tendency to consumption and overconsumption. It's a liberation, as he says, from oneself. Right? The liberation from the idea that I'm an absolute reality, that I am God. It's a kind of idolatry. It's not a kind of idolatry. It is idolatry. Idolatry is taking for God, the absolutely absolute, that which is not God, like me, a relative absolute. That's a kind of idolatry. Anything that's higher than the absolutely absolute is a kind of idolatry, and we are idolizers so often. These forms of liberation are always both individual or personal, and always social and historical at the same time. We can never miss that. It's one of the critiques of liberation theology is, well, these liberation theologians stop talking about individuals and personal sin. They stop talking about repentance and confession, and they're always talking about social structures, and they're always talking about politics. Well, they are talking about those things because the tradition didn't. The tradition thought that sin was simply personal and individual, and that's how you were going to deal with sin in the world on an individual, personal basis. You have to do that. Ellacuría and the liberation theologians said, we certainly have to do that. But you also have to attend to the impersonal, social, historical structures of sin and all the pernicious negative effects of them as well. Liberation is personal. The objective of liberation is justice for all. Everyone has what is their due as human persons in community. There's no justice without freedom, but definitely no freedom without justice. Right? It's impossible to think justice without freedom. But you can't even really be free without justice. That's what I was talking about before. Even if you're the beneficiary, apparently, of an unjust social system, you're still stuck. I mean, a classic example is slavery. The slave owner is stuck in a system that has slaves. He's stuck in that system. That's why he needed those guns and those mean dogs, because he knew that the slaves weren't really by nature any less free than he was, and they could freely decide one day to get up and get rid of him and move on. So he's stuck sleeping with one eye open every night because he knows that system is unjust. He's stuck in that system. He's benefiting way more than the slaves, don't get me wrong. But he is not as best as he could be anymore than those who were enslaved by him and in that social structure of slavery. Liberation is also social. The poor must realize this project historically. And remember, that word doesn't mean, it just dawned on me, like realized it. No, it means, like Zubiri says, to make real, to make reality, to actualize the actualness of the possibilities and the capacities in history. It's a social project as well. You have to make it happen. And it's theologal, right? It's that religious dimension, the dimension of relegation that we talked about in Zubiri. Ellacuría writes, the creative freedom of humanity is a prolongation of the creative freedom of God. And it is more free and creative as long as it prolongs the action of God along the lines of love. God's love is expressed by human freedom, being free, and actualize a world in that light, in that capacity. Ellacuría continues, the possibility of and call for that creative freedom are already inscribed within human reality itself. This is not so just by the imperative will of God, but in that reality itself is already the real potency placed by God in the community beyond its own personal life. However, that possibility and that reality are realized in a world of sin that also is rooted in human freedom and in the congenital limitation of human nature. In spite of the limited way of being God that humans possess as limited beings, they do have the possibility not just of overcoming sin, but of becoming like God. This is by the very gift of God's self and not by any Promethean effort, which is certainly idolatry. Now there's a bit to unpack there, but look at the emphasized passage. That's straight out of Zubiri, that the human is in a way God, a limited way, a vector of God, but God, and it's a way of being God humanly, and we can't forget that. That's at the root of this liberatory engagement that Ellacuría is calling us to. In fact, he thinks reality, which would be God, the absolute ground of reality, is calling us to. He says it's the possibility of overcoming sin is a gift of that God as the ultimate ground of reality. It's not because in spite of all that we are on our own and have to make some kind of heroic effort to make it happen, although it may call for heroism in certain situations. But to think it's all on us as individuals is a kind of idolatry again. It's forgetting where the real ground of reality is coming from, not from our own will, as Nietzsche might say, but from the ultimate ground of reality, absolutely absolute, of which we are relative absolute vectors.